In the autumn of 2018, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus Thompson sat in his fifth-grade classroom in Atlanta, Georgia, when his teacher, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, began a lesson on the civil rights movement. As she displayed a photograph of Martin Luther King Jr. on the projector screen, Marcus suddenly stood up, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. His eyes fixed on the image with an intensity that made Mrs. Henderson pause mid-sentence. Marcus's voice, when he spoke, carried a cadence and depth that seemed impossible for a child. "I know that man. I know him because I was him. I remember standing on those steps. I remember every word I said that day, and I remember why I had to say them." The classroom fell silent. 23 fifth graders stared at their classmate, some giggling nervously, others simply confused. Mrs. Henderson, an experienced educator who had taught for 18 years, felt her professional composure falter. "Marcus, what do you mean?" The boy's eyes never left the photograph. "I remember Memphis. I remember the balcony. I remember the sound." His voice cracked slightly. "I remember not being afraid, even though I should have been. I had seen it coming. I had dreamed about it." Then, as suddenly as the episode began, Marcus seemed to return to himself. He looked around the classroom, apparently startled by the attention, and sat down quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment. Mrs. Henderson called Marcus's parents that afternoon. David and Angela Thompson arrived at the school within an hour, concerned and confused. Their son had always been a bright, sensitive child with a strong sense of justice, but this was something entirely different. That evening, as the family sat around their dinner table in their modest home in the Weston neighborhood, Marcus seemed normal, joking with his younger sister, complaining about homework, asking if he could play video games after dinner. But when Angela tucked him into bed that night, Marcus looked up at her with an expression that seemed suddenly older, weighted with something she couldn't name. "Mom, have you ever felt like you've lived before? Like you remember things that happened before you were born?" Angela Thompson was a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital, a woman of science and practical faith. She attended Ebenezer Baptist Church every Sunday, the same church where Martin Luther King Jr.'s father had preached, where King himself had served as co-pastor. But she had never given much thought to reincarnation or past lives. Those concepts seemed distant from her Baptist upbringing. Yet as she looked at her son, she couldn't dismiss the genuine confusion and distress in his eyes. "Tell me what you remember, baby." Marcus closed his eyes. "I remember speeches. Lots of speeches. I remember my voice getting tired, but knowing I had to keep talking because people were listening, really listening. I remember a jail cell in Birmingham. I remember writing on paper that wasn't meant for writing. I remember marching and my feet hurting and being so tired, but knowing we couldn't stop." Over the following weeks, Marcus began experiencing vivid dreams that left him exhausted and emotionally drained. He would wake crying, describing visions of violence, fire hoses, police dogs, angry crowds. He drew pictures of buses and lunch counters, of signs that read, "Whites Only." He spoke about places he had never visited: Montgomery, Selma, Birmingham. The details were far beyond what his school curriculum had covered. David Thompson, a high school history teacher, was both fascinated and disturbed. He began documenting everything Marcus said, recording their conversations, collecting the drawings, noting the dates and context of each episode. One evening, Marcus described the interior of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, including specific details about the pastor's study, the placement of bookshelves, a window that looked out onto a courtyard, the feeling of the wooden chair where he would sit to prepare sermons. He spoke about the weight of responsibility, about being young and uncertain, but feeling called to leadership he hadn't sought. David researched these details and found them accurate down to architectural elements that weren't visible in typical photographs or mentioned in standard biographies. The pastor's study had been renovated several times since the 1950s, but historical photographs confirmed Marcus's description of the original layout. Angela struggled with what was happening to her son. She spoke with Reverend James Crawford at Ebenezer Baptist, seeking spiritual guidance. Reverend Crawford was a thoughtful man who had studied theology at Morehouse College, the same institution King had attended. He listened carefully to Angela's account and agreed to meet with Marcus. The meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon in the church office, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out onto Auburn Avenue. Reverend Crawford began with simple questions about Marcus's faith, his understanding of God, his feelings about justice and equality. Marcus answered thoughtfully, but it was when the Reverend asked about his memories that the boy's demeanor changed. "I remember this church," Marcus said quietly. "Not this office, but the sanctuary. I remember my father preaching. Daddy King, people called him. I remember the sound of the congregation, the way voices would rise together during hymns. I remember being young and wanting to make him proud, but also wanting to find my own path." Reverend Crawford felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. The details Marcus provided, the relationship between King and his father, the dynamics of that relationship, the young King's struggle to establish his own identity, matched historical accounts, but weren't the kind of information typically emphasized in children's education about the civil rights leader. "Tell me about your dream," the Reverend said carefully. "The famous speech." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a rhythm that seemed borrowed from another time. "People remember the dream part because that's what gives hope. But the speech wasn't about a dream when I started. It was about a promissory note that America had defaulted on. It was about the urgency of now. It was about not being satisfied with gradualism and tokenism." He paused, his young face serious. "The dream came at the end because Mahalia shouted for it. She knew the people needed that hope, needed to imagine what we were fighting for, not just what we were fighting against. So I gave them the dream, but the dream was built on righteous anger and impatience with injustice." Reverend Crawford recognized the references immediately. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer who had been present at the March on Washington, had indeed called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin," during the speech, encouraging King to include the famous passage he had used in earlier addresses. This detail appeared in historical accounts, but wasn't widely known, certainly not typically taught to elementary school children. The Reverend asked Marcus if he could recite any of the speech. The boy closed his eyes and began to speak, his voice taking on a cadence and power that seemed to fill the small office. The words flowed with perfect accuracy, but more than that, they carried emotional weight, as though Marcus understood not just what the words meant, but what it had cost to speak them. Reverend Crawford contacted Dr. Evelyn Richards, a psychologist at Emory University who specialized in childhood memory phenomena and had published research on unusual cognitive experiences in children. Dr. Richards was initially skeptical. Cases involving famous historical figures were particularly problematic because the individuals were so well documented in media and popular culture. Distinguishing genuine, anomalous memory from information absorbed through normal channels was extremely difficult. But she agreed to evaluate Marcus, intrigued by Reverend Crawford's detailed account and the specificity of the boy's claims. The first session took place at Dr. Richards' office on a gray November morning. Marcus arrived with both parents, visibly nervous. Dr. Richards began with standard psychological assessments, establishing baseline cognitive function and emotional state. Marcus was clearly intelligent, testing above grade level in verbal comprehension and reasoning. He showed no signs of dissociative disorders, psychosis, or other conditions that might produce false memories or delusional beliefs. When Dr. Richards finally asked about his memories of being Martin Luther King Jr., Marcus seemed relieved to talk about it openly. "I don't remember everything," he explained. "It's not like watching a movie of someone else's life. It's more like sometimes I just know things. I know how places felt, how situations felt. I remember emotions really strongly. The fear, the faith, the exhaustion, the hope. Sometimes I remember specific moments really clearly, like photographs in my mind. Other times, it's more like a general sense of having experienced something." Dr. Richards asked him to describe specific memories. Marcus spoke about the Montgomery bus boycott, about the complex logistics of organizing carpools and maintaining unity in the face of economic pressure and violence. He described Rosa Parks not as a tired woman who spontaneously refused to give up her seat, the simplified narrative often taught to children, but as a trained activist, secretary of the NAACP, someone carefully chosen to be the face of the boycott because of her unimpeachable character and middle-class respectability. This nuanced understanding of the civil rights movement suggested engagement with material well beyond elementary school level. Dr. Richards brought in Dr. Thomas Harrison, a historian from Georgia State University who specialized in the civil rights movement. Dr. Harrison conducted what he called verification interviews, mixing accurate historical information with deliberate inaccuracies to see if Marcus would correct them. When Dr. Harrison mentioned that King had written his famous letter from Birmingham jail on notebook paper, Marcus shook his head. No, it started on newspaper margins. The guards wouldn't give me proper paper at first. I wrote on whatever I could find, newspaper margins, later some paper that lawyers smuggled in. The guards thought it was legal documents. Dr. Harrison confirmed this was accurate. King had indeed begun the letter on newspaper margins and scraps of paper before eventually obtaining proper writing material. Dr. Harrison showed Marcus photographs from the civil rights era, including images from lesser-known events not typically featured in textbooks. When shown a photograph from the Albany movement, a campaign that was generally considered a strategic failure, Marcus studied it carefully. Albany taught us important lessons. We learned that you needed a clear target, a specific goal. In Albany, we fought against everything, so we couldn't focus public attention. In Birmingham, we learned to pick the battleground carefully to dramatize the conflict in ways that would reach people's conscience. Dr. Harrison was struck by this analysis. It reflected King's own assessment of the Albany campaign, an analysis that appeared in King's writings and private correspondence but wasn't typically discussed in popular accounts of the movement. Marcus's parents struggled with the implications of what their son was experiencing. David found himself reading everything he could about reincarnation, consciousness studies, and parapsychology, fields he had previously dismissed as pseudoscience. Angela prayed constantly, seeking guidance from a faith tradition that didn't easily accommodate the idea of multiple lifetimes. Yet both parents were forced to confront evidence that didn't fit comfortable explanations. Marcus knew things he seemingly had no way of knowing. He demonstrated understanding of historical events and personal relationships that went far beyond what any child should possess, even a gifted one with access to extensive resources. Dr. Richards expanded her research team to include Dr. Carol Bowman, a therapist from Pennsylvania who had spent decades investigating children's past life memories. Dr. Bowman had developed specific protocols for these cases, distinguishing genuine anomalous memories from fantasy, imagination, or information absorbed through normal means. She traveled to Atlanta to observe Marcus over a period of several weeks. What impressed Dr. Bowman was the emotional consistency of Marcus's accounts. He didn't recount historical facts with detached memorization. He described experiences with deep feeling, often becoming emotional when discussing certain events. When speaking about the deaths of other civil rights workers, Medgar Evers, the 4 girls killed in the Birmingham church bombing, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Marcus wept with a grief that seemed personal, immediate, not abstract historical sympathy. The case attracted international attention when Dr. Richards presented preliminary findings at a conference on consciousness studies in Tucson, Arizona. The response was sharply divided. Some researchers, particularly those involved in reincarnation studies at the University of Virginia and other institutions, found the evidence compelling and consistent with other documented cases. Critics argued that Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most documented figures in American history, that his speeches were taught in schools, that Marcus could have absorbed information from countless sources without conscious awareness. The debate played out in academic journals and online forums, with both sides presenting passionate arguments. To address concerns about information contamination, Dr. Richards arranged for Marcus's home to be forensically examined. Computer historians analyzed every device the family owned, checking browsing histories, downloaded files, streaming video logs, anything that might indicate Marcus had been exposed to detailed information about King's life. They found typical children's content, YouTube videos of video game playthroughs, educational cartoons, music videos. There was some age-appropriate civil rights material from school assignments, but nothing that explained the depth of Marcus's knowledge. His school's curriculum on the civil rights movement was limited to basic facts: King's leadership, famous speeches, the March on Washington, his assassination. It didn't cover strategic debates within the movement, personal relationships, or the kind of tactical analysis Marcus had demonstrated. In the spring of 2019, the research team arranged for Marcus to visit the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, built around the Lorraine Motel where King was assassinated. The trip was emotionally challenging for everyone involved. Marcus was visibly anxious during the flight to Memphis, unable to articulate why he felt such dread about the visit. When they arrived at the museum, he initially refused to leave the parking lot. Angela knelt beside him, holding his hands. "Baby, we don't have to do this if you don't want to. We could go back to the hotel right now." Marcus shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, I need to see it. I need to remember all of it, not just parts." The museum chronicled the entire civil rights movement, from slave ships through the modern era, but the heart of it was room 306 and the balcony where King had been standing when he was shot. As the group moved through the exhibits, Marcus provided quiet commentary, noting details that resonated with memory. "Ralph was like a brother to me. We didn't always agree on strategy, but I trusted him completely." He was referring to Ralph Abernathy, King's closest friend and colleague. When they reached the section about the sanitation workers' strike that had brought King to Memphis, Marcus spoke about the moral urgency of economic justice, about how poverty was a form of violence, about how true equality required economic opportunity, not just legal rights. Then they reached the preserved motel rooms. Marcus stood at the entrance, staring at the balcony visible through plexiglass. He wouldn't enter. He stood frozen, tears running down his face, his breathing shallow and rapid. Dr. Richards recognized the signs of a panic attack and gently guided him away from the exhibit, out to a quiet courtyard where he could sit and breathe. When Marcus finally could speak, his voice was barely a whisper. "I wasn't afraid for myself. I was afraid for everyone else, for what it would mean if I wasn't there to keep the movement nonviolent. I was afraid the dream would die with me, but I knew it was coming. I had seen it in dreams. I had felt it approaching like a storm. And on that balcony, in those last moments, I felt peace. I had said what needed to be said. I had done what I was called to do." The psychological impact of these experiences on Marcus became a central concern for everyone involved in his care. He was carrying memories of trauma, violence, and death, memories that felt personally real. Dr. Richards and Dr. Bowman worked intensively with Marcus and his family to develop coping strategies. They emphasized that Marcus was his own person, living his own life, that whatever memories he carried didn't define his identity or determine his path. They helped him establish boundaries between present and past, between his life as Marcus Thompson and the memories of another life. The work was delicate, requiring them to acknowledge the reality of Marcus's experiences while also helping him stay grounded in his present identity. By the summer of 2019, the memories began to shift in character. Marcus still had access to them, but they felt more distant, less immediate. He could recall what he had experienced, but the overwhelming emotional intensity lessened. He stopped having the vivid dreams that had disrupted his sleep for months. He returned to typical childhood interests: basketball, video games, hanging out with friends. Though he retained a serious engagement with questions of justice and equality that his parents recognized as unusual for a 10-year-old. His teachers noticed that, during discussions of current events, Marcus had insights about strategy and organizing that seemed remarkably sophisticated. Dr. Richards and her colleagues compiled their findings into a comprehensive case study. They documented over 200 specific claims Marcus had made about Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, experiences, and perspectives. Of the claims that could be verified against historical records, primary sources, and expert testimony, approximately 75% were accurate. Many of these accurate claims involved information that wasn't readily available in standard biographical accounts. Details from personal correspondence, tactical discussions within the movement, private conversations, emotional states during specific events. The linguistic analysis revealed that Marcus sometimes used phrasing and rhetorical structures characteristic of King's speaking and writing style, though less formally than the prepared speeches that most people knew. The researchers were careful to acknowledge limitations in their conclusions. They couldn't definitively prove that Marcus possessed memories from a previous life. As Martin Luther King Jr., they presented alternative hypotheses: cryptomnesia, hidden memories of information encountered and forgotten; super ESP, the theoretical ability to psychically access information from historical records or collective memory, or some other mechanism not yet understood by science. But they also noted that none of these alternative explanations fully accounted for the totality of evidence. The emotional consistency, the experiential quality of the memories, the sophisticated analysis beyond Marcus's developmental level, and the specific detailed knowledge that seemed inaccessible through normal means. Critics of the study raised important methodological concerns. They noted that children are highly suggestible and that the research process itself might have influenced Marcus's memories or encouraged elaboration of initially vague impressions. They argued that Martin Luther King Jr.'s prominence in American culture made it inevitable that children would be exposed to extensive information about his life, even if that exposure wasn't consciously remembered. They suggested that Marcus's intelligence and sensitivity to social justice might have led him to identify strongly with King, and that this identification could have transformed into a belief in actual past life memory. These criticisms sparked productive debate about research protocols in studying anomalous experiences. Dr. Harrison, the historian who had worked with Marcus, published his own analysis of the case. He noted that Marcus's understanding of the civil rights movement reflected what historians called the mature King, the figure who in his final years was moving beyond the integrationist focus of his earlier work to challenge economic inequality, militarism, and systemic injustice. This more radical King was less emphasized in popular culture and children's education than the safe, palatable version enshrined in the "I Have a Dream" speech. Yet Marcus consistently demonstrated understanding of this broader vision, discussing the Poor People's Campaign, King's opposition to the Vietnam War, and his criticism of capitalism with sophistication that suggested genuine engagement with complex ideas. For the Thompson family, the experience profoundly changed their understanding of consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence. David found himself incorporating questions about memory and consciousness into his history classes, encouraging students to think about how we know what we know and what it means to understand history. Angela developed a deeper spiritual life, wrestling with questions about soul continuity and divine purpose. Marcus's younger sister, Jasmine, grew up accepting that her brother was somehow special, that he carried experiences that made him different, though she approached it all with the practical acceptance of a child who had never known any other reality. As Marcus entered middle school, he seemed to settle into a new equilibrium. The intense memories faded further, becoming more like distant recollections than vivid experiences. But they left their mark. Marcus developed a passion for social justice and activism that went beyond typical adolescent idealism. He organized a protest at his school when administrators tried to implement a dress code policy that students felt unfairly targeted Black students' natural hairstyles. He volunteered with organizations working on voting rights and criminal justice reform. When asked why these issues mattered so much to him, he would say simply that he felt called to this work, that justice wasn't optional or abstract, but urgent and personal. At age 13, Marcus wrote an essay for school about his experiences. He titled it "Memories That Aren't Mine." In it, he acknowledged the strangeness of what he had been through and the uncertainty that remained about what it all meant. "I don't know if I was really Dr. King in a past life," he wrote. "I don't know if I somehow accessed his memories through some mechanism science doesn't understand yet. I don't know if this was all some elaborate trick my mind played on me. But I know the experiences felt real. I know they taught me that the struggle for justice is never finished, that every generation has to take up the work again. I know they gave me a sense of responsibility to use whatever gifts I have to make things better. Whether those memories came from past life or from somewhere else entirely, I'm grateful for what they taught me about courage, faith, and a long arc of the moral universe. Dr. Richards continued to follow Marcus's development, checking in periodically to document the long-term effects of his experiences. She noted that unlike many children who claimed past life memories and then completely forgot them as they grew older, Marcus retained access to his memories while integrating them into a coherent sense of self. He didn't identify as Martin Luther King Jr. reincarnated. He identified as Marcus Thompson, a young man who happened to carry memories and insights that shaped his values and informed his activism. This integration, Dr. Richards suggested, represented perhaps the healthiest possible outcome of such an unusual experience. The case of Marcus Thompson remains one of the most documented instances of a child claiming past life memories of a major historical figure. The research generated significant academic debate and contributed to ongoing discussions about the nature of consciousness, memory, and identity. Some researchers viewed the case as compelling evidence that consciousness might survive bodily death and reincarnate. Others maintained that it demonstrated the remarkable complexity of human memory and cognition without requiring supernatural explanations. The debate continues, with Marcus's case regularly cited in both parapsychology and skeptical literature. For Marcus himself, now a young man, the experiences became part of his origin story, the strange foundation upon which he built his identity and values. He remained interested in civil rights history, reading extensively about the movement and the people who made it happen. But he also branched out into other interests. He loved music, excelled at basketball, studied computer programming, and dreamed of becoming a lawyer specializing in civil rights cases. When asked by reporters or researchers whether he still believed he had been Martin Luther King Jr., he gave an answer that reflected both his intelligence and his humility. "I can't prove what happened to me. I just know that something real and transformative occurred. Those memories, whatever their source, gave me a sense of purpose and a commitment to justice that shapes everything I do. In the end, maybe that's what matters most. Not whether I literally was Dr. King, but whether I honor the vision and values that those memories represent." The Thompson family remained active at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Marcus occasionally spoke to youth groups about his experiences and his commitment to continuing the work of social justice. Reverend Crawford noted that Marcus had a gift for making historical struggles feel immediate and relevant, for helping young people understand that the fight for equality wasn't something that happened in the past, but an ongoing struggle requiring their participation. Whether Marcus carries memories from a past life or has simply been blessed with extraordinary insight, the Reverend said, he carries forward the dream. And in the end, that's what Dr. King would have wanted, not veneration of his memory, but continuation of his work. The scientific investigation into Marcus's case contributed to a growing body of research on childhood past life memories, particularly the subset of cases involving historical figures. Dr. Richards and her colleagues published multiple papers analyzing different aspects of the case: the linguistic patterns, the emotional consistency, the quality of historical knowledge, the psychological impact. They were careful to present their findings as raising important questions rather than providing definitive answers. Science, they noted, advances by taking seriously anomalous data that doesn't fit existing paradigms, by investigating rather than dismissing experiences that challenge our understanding of reality. As this account draws to a close, Marcus Thompson is 17 years old, a high school senior preparing to attend Morehouse College on a full scholarship, the same institution that educated Martin Luther King Jr. decades earlier. He plans to major in political science and sociology, with the goal of attending law school and eventually working on criminal justice reform. His childhood experiences, whether memories of a past life or some other phenomenon entirely, shaped him into a thoughtful, committed young man who understands that justice requires both moral vision and practical strategy, both righteous anger and sustainable hope. The mystery of what happened to him may never be fully resolved, but its impact on his life, and potentially on all the lives he'll touch through his future work, is undeniable. If you're fascinated by the mysteries of consciousness and the possibility that memory might transcend individual lifetimes, consider exploring the extensive research being done in this field. Cases like Marcus's remind us that reality may be far stranger and more wondrous than our current scientific frameworks can fully explain. They challenge us to remain open to possibilities while maintaining rigorous standards of evidence. Whether consciousness survives death, whether we live multiple lives, whether memory can somehow exist beyond individual brains, these remain among the deepest questions we can ask about the nature of existence. And sometimes, those questions arrive not through abstract philosophy, but through the experiences of a child who claims to remember a life that ended before his began.